So Brian, I met you at XY Planning Network conference, XYPN Live, 2 years ago, waiting in the cold for the bus to drive us back and forth between, the stadium and where the conference was. One of the things that fascinated me about learning you was a few things. One, also being a follower of Christ. You mentioned servant leadership in our conversation, and you also mentioned that you worked as an advisor and you work as a business coach for advisors and also non-advisor business owners. So what motivated you to transition from being an advisor to becoming a business coach?
When you're an advisor, you're going to have a vision in some way of what it is that you're going to do in the future, right? And that could be, and I could have had a vision of, I'm going to build out the greatest financial advisor firm ever, right? I'm going to build out the dream financial advisor firm for me. And I had that dream originally of kind of what that looked like, but I also had this bigger purpose of I didn't have the vision of wanting to just be like a solo advisor and just work with, my people and kind of do everything myself. I was looking at it from this vision of how can I have the greatest impact on this industry that I can have? Because I was starting in this industry back in 2007 when financial planning wasn't really a thing. Nobody talked about it. There wasn't a subscription model back then. I was one of the first advisors to do those kind of ideas. And so when I was working through that process and thinking of what that looks like, I saw a greater impact that I could make on others by influencing and sharing ideas and helping others, do the same thing and really make a movement in the industry versus maybe the little ripple that I could have made just as an advisor doing it myself, but not impacted as many other advisors, right? So I kind of sat back and thought, well, I can be an advisor and I can serve my 150, 200, or however big the firm gets, within that range, or I can go serve X amount of advisors out there and then impact not just them, but then their changing behavior of how they react with their clients, can have that impact all the way down the stream. And so that was the motivating factor of it. Then you have to have the ability to do it, right? Like a skill set. And so I got really addicted to leadership is the way I put it, to where I said, I'm going to study leadership. I'm going to, again, live this on a daily basis with my own business and then starting to help others with their businesses, to really be dedicated to how can we be the best leaders we can be in this industry and serving others. And you mentioned that, we talked about that night, in Denver is, it comes back to your core values. For me, my core values are around servant leadership. It's around innovative thinking. It's around delivering joy and peace. And so as I think about those things, it was, okay, well, in light of those core values, what's the absolute best way you can be an advisor? And then what are the things that we're missing as leaders of advisor firms to actually be able to execute that and see that vision come true? And so that's kind of my story. That's my history. I've coached thousands of advisors now over the last decade plus, and just really enjoy the impact that I can make, because there's a lot of challenges to being an advisor. We all face it. I still feel it myself, today, as I go through it. And so it's, how can we deal with those stresses? How can we deal with those challenges and live out these visions that we have?
One of the funniest things about this conversation is this is coming full circle. Like, I hired you before Measure Twice Planners was like a website, like before it was like really
Yep.
like an idea. And one of the first things you helped me do is like define those core values, which now I share with the community of generosity, transparency, intentionality, curiosity. From your perspective, what is your role? I know that business coaches do things differently, but what do you consider, like, what is your role as a business coach?
I've always had this background in sports, right? So I grew up playing basketball. I grew up playing all kinds of sports, but that was my love when it comes to sports. And one of the things that was, again, interesting to me growing up is you have good coaches and then you have bad coaches in sports, right? And of course, there's a whole spectrum there. It's not just two categories, but a whole spectrum along that line of where those coaches fall. But I was always paying attention to what made this coach really, really good. Like, one of the best coaches I played for, or two of them, I guess, would be D Rowe and Wes Shepard. Like, what made them so special as coaches that they got the most out of their players and they had success with their teams, but not just success from winning games, success from those player relationships and player development and people reaching more than their full potential, so to say, right? Like me in basketball, I probably reached more than my full potential, but it was because of these great coaches. So what made them special? And then you had coaches that you look back on and you're like, well, man, they really had a detriment to the culture of their team. They really were the one holding back the people on their team. They weren't allowing people to thrive in what they were doing. And so when I think of this question of what's the role of a business coach, it's to be a good leader for other leaders, number one, right? So I need to be a good leader and somebody that actually has experience and has studied and thoughtfully put together how I could be a leader for other leaders going through similar challenges, but also have to be someone that you create this environment around the individual that you're coaching, that it's all about them. It's all custom around them. And that should really be the role of a coach, is to be that sounding board, that guide, that someone with an expertise or some extra experience or knowledge that they can now share, so that we don't repeat and make the same mistakes of people in the past that have already gone through what you're going through. So at the end of the day, I think all teams are better with a coach than without, even if I go back to sports, and then it applies to the business world too. But then how do you make sure that as a coach, like on my side, what's my role? It's to be the best leader, the best coach, focused on the player development of who I'm working with in that moment. And that needs to be custom to them and how they can thrive in the situation that they're in.
I mentioned the Measure Twice Planners course that, when we're working with somebody, we have to first understand where they are before determining where to go and how to get there. And one thing that, if somebody asked me, like, what is the benefit of working with a coach? I've specifically worked with Brian one-on-one, is that you really wanted to understand me as a person. You gave space to truly understand me so that you could actually be more of a guide than, it's very much like building a story brand. Like, not like you still help me be the hero of my business ownership, and you are guiding me alongside as a co-pilot. When does it make sense to hire a coach?
I would just say my personal belief on this is, again, you're better with a coach than without. And maybe we could even change that to, at a very informal level, you're better with a mentor than without, right? And so if you are not having someone mentor you, if you're not having someone formally coach you, and we can talk about the difference of that if we want to go down that rabbit trail, to me, you can't reach your full potential. For me personally, I cannot reach my full potential if I don't have somebody mentoring and coaching and leading me to be better. And like to what you were talking about earlier, being that coach that's watching the game, that doesn't have a bias in the game or the emotions in the game, that can just be like, hey, here's some challenges, or here's some blind spots that we have that we really need to start considering. Like, hey, what's the end in mind on this thing? Oh, well, nobody's ever asked me that before. I'm not worried about that right now. I'm just trying to build my firm. That's what a coach is for, is to be pushing us and challenging us to do more than we would do or think about otherwise.
The analogy that comes to mind is like a spotter in the gym when you're doing a bench press. Is they teach you proper form. They really challenge you beyond your own limiting beliefs. I have a belief about something. You go, wait, let's dig deeper there. Like, is that belief true? Right? Don't believe everything you think from a cognitive behavioral element. But they teach you good form. They challenge your limited beliefs. But the thing is, you don't lift the weights for me, right? But you kind of help me. You help me avoid dropping them on my face.
Right.
Right. So again, as a coach, like I love that you still you actually empower me to implement successfully, rather than like kind of taking over the run. You're not taking over my business. You're just providing that support that I really need along the way. And I think a lot of it is mental, not technical.
Right. You don't hire a coach to be a doer of things for you. You don't hire them to say like, here, I want you to do these things for me over the next couple weeks or something like that, like complete action steps. You're hiring a coach to think with them, right? At the end of the day, what we're doing is we're giving ourselves space to think. And sometimes, I would say actually most of the time when I'm working with leaders, that's what's lacking, is that space to think, because we're running around having to do so many things and so much weight falls on our shoulder of holding this thing together, that we're lacking that dedicated time to strategically think. And that's what a coach can do for you, whether it's me or somebody else, is it gives you time to out loud think, have a sounding board, and work through those things and get challenged in the middle of it.
People come to you for one thing, but you actually help them realize they needed something else.
Yeah,
And
a lot
like
of
with
times.
that said, like what are the most common topics that business owners need help with, or at least they assume they need help with when they first hire you for coaching?
As leaders, we are typically overloaded, which is what we were just kind of touching on, right? So most leaders, if we talk about the most common thing that I'm dealing with as they start working with me, is they're saying like, hey, the number one thing I need help with is I got way too much going on, or I'm working way too hard, or I'm stressed, or you're going to hear it come in a variety of forms, but I'm just going to title it overloaded.
I need two of me in my business right now, right?
Yep. And they start to think that way too. Like, man, if there was two of me, think what I could accomplish. Right. But then there's these other things in life that they're wanting to get to, whether that's more in the business or more. I'll go back to my core value of joy and peace. It's like, man, I get joy and peace out of these things, but I'm being dragged into doing all these other things. And so then the question becomes, how do you go from point A, where you are today, where you're overloaded, not doing all the things you want to do, et cetera, to point B, where it's not going to be perfect world. I'm not a euphoria guy where it's like everything's going to be perfect. There's always going to be problems. But how do you move to that point B where you're getting more joy and peace out of your career and out of your leadership role because you're doing more of the things that you want to do? You're not as overloaded. And now we're into that thriving mode in leadership, is what I call it. So that's a challenge to get there and to do that. And one of the big keys to this, when I think of like, so what are we working on when you ask this question, what are those topics when leaders are coming to me, is we bring it back a lot of times to this idea of what's your vision? And then what are the actions that you're doing, and are those aligned, right? Because if we think about what we work on with most people as they're coming in the doors, they either have a very clear vision, but they lack the action alignment to make that vision become true in reality, or they come to us in a situation where they don't have a vision, but they're doing all kinds of great action. And if you look at it, it's like, man, that's really good action, but we have no clue where it's leading because we don't have a very clear vision. And so it's starting to work on those things in connection to that overload part that really releases somebody to start to get to where they want to get to.
One of the first things we did together, I know you mentioned vision, and I'm the type of person who, kind of, you're helping me get over like some of this like perfectionism and paralysis by analysis. Literally, the name of my brand is Measure Twice, right? Quality
Right.
control is really important. Let's step back to one of the first things we did together in terms of exercises to define the vision of the Measure Twice brand, like kind of the umbrella brand. And then also what's the vision of each company within the brand? And could you explain like what is a vision, and how does that vision influence the actions that a business owner takes?
So when you think of a vision, it's really, I'm going to call it your internal desire, your internal drive of like, what is it that you want this thing to become? And I'm just going to call it a thing because this really is like when you're an owner or you're a founder, it's like, it's kind of your clay to mold the way you want, right? But what I would encourage you to do, and I encouraged you to do this, is sit down and say, but where is this really leading? Like, where do I want this to go? What do I want this to become? And so I think I shared with you a visual that I use a lot, which I don't mind sharing with the group here today, if you want to pull that up. One of the most common ways I've seen visions explained is people call it climbing the mountaintop, or there's these presentations out there of like, what's your Mount Everest and stuff, right? And for me personally, those analogies are okay, but they break down a lot because, what do you do when you get to the top of Mount Everest? You come back down. And I'm like, well, that's not how I want my business to go, right? Like, what? That doesn't make sense. I don't look at it as we're ever done exploring, or we're ever done innovating, or we're ever done. So there is no reaching that mountaintop. So it's more planting your flag along the way of where you're going. And so I use this analogy of, it's like going to space. And the great thing about space and the way God created our world and our universe is that it's expansive and it's beyond our knowledge of reach of understanding, right? And so there's all this more innovation and things that we can learn and explore the next area and explore the next area. And so in this analogy, you start on Earth and there you are getting ready to launch your business, or you have launched, or we can back this up. You could have a business for years and you're just ready to finally launch a clear vision or a new vision. And the first thing you got to work on ultimately is you're going to have to figure out how to get to space first. I mean, that's what we had to do as the United States. We didn't just go straight to the moon. We first had to figure out, how do you get to space? And then once we get to space in that phase of our development of a vision, so I'm going to connect this to vision, that first vision phase, then I can go to the moon. And so what does going to the moon look like in my business? What does that vision look like? And then if I accomplish that and I get to that vision, now I can talk about, well, what's it look like to go to Mars and start to explore that part of space. And that's a new development. It's new stretches. It's new technology. It's new things we got to do in order to reach that. And then going to Jupiter, I use as an example. Now, Jupiter's a ball of gas, so it's a bad example because you can't land on it. But I just like it because it's the bigger planet in the solar system, right? It's that next bigger thing as far as the visual of what we're trying to think of here. So when I'm helping somebody with vision and we think about defining vision, vision is not this one statement. Again, going back to like that mountaintop example, it's not like, well, here's going to the mountaintop and then I'm good, because that's not in reality how it works in business, right? What it is it's morphing and it's going in phases and it's exploring more areas. And at certain times you're going to turn back and say, yeah, no, I don't want to explore that anymore. I want to go this way now. Let's go check this area out. And so it's more flexible and fluid than just climbing a mountaintop. But thinking of it in phases has really helped my clients get more confident and more excited about their vision, because it doesn't have to be so rigid, but it also can have phases to how you get to what it is that you're looking to mold and build out of your business.
It sounds like to me, a lot of business owners, they kind of get this backwards, so focused on building the shuttle, they don't even know where they want to go with it. Or
Right.
vice versa. They're looking at the stars, just like wishing they were there, but they're not implementing anything like to actually get there. One thing I wrote down here is a lot of financial planners are owning a business rather than being a business owner who's a financial planner. And the way that works is financial planners, they're usually like great technicians. So they're technicians that launch a business, and then they either realize that they actually wanted to be a technician, or like me, they actually realize they love being an entrepreneur, which means that
Right.
we get stuck on thinking like rungs of ladders, like of saying, okay, you get your Series 65, you get your CFP designation, you join a firm. Like there's all these very like binary, like you do this or you don't do that. And we get so focused on destination that we don't focus on journey. When I passed the CFP exam, like I celebrated for like 30 minutes and then I was like, now what? Rather getting caught up in like these metrics of like success of like doing this thing means I'm successful, you find success in the development and the journey, which by the way, like that's one of the things about working with a coach is that when you don't have a mentor or a coach, sometimes you don't realize, I mean, I know Michael Kitces, like he has the picture of like the iceberg. You only see the tip of the iceberg and not all the stuff that went into it. Being in a service industry, we're friendly to everybody but ourselves. Yep. I think sometimes having a coach can help, or a mentor can help, not just validate what we're doing technically in our business or giving us advice on what to do in our business, but they can also help us realize like how far we've come. One of the things that you helped me realize is that I didn't want my metric of success to be revenue. I wanted to be focusing on scaling impact, not scaling revenue. Could you talk a little bit about the idea of metrics? So a lot of advisors are focused on metrics, especially quantitative, like number of clients, AUM. What are the advantages and disadvantages of following quantitative metrics?
Unfortunately, a lot of times we work through that vision sheet and somebody will say, well, going to Jupiter for me is making $2 million. I'm just making something up here, right? And I would change that on anybody that tells me that. And I would say, well, that's not a vision, that's a metric, right? And so the question is, what the vision really is who you're going to become as a company and as yourself. And so the question is, why $2 million? Like, why not 3? Why not 1? What's the difference? Like, so it gets into this thought process of why that metric becomes, well, this is who I have to become for that metric to be a reality, but why? And if we get that answer, then you really get down to what your vision is. So you wouldn't want to take a vision and say, this is $3 million, this is $2 million, this is 1, and this is 500,000. That's my vision. No, why those metrics as you go through it, right? And a vision is not a metric. It is, again, here's who we're going to become as a company or as a person. That's my vision. And that will have consequences to it, both good and bad, of what my metrics are going to look like that I could expect from such a situation that I become in that way.
You have to determine like, who are you going to serve? How are you going to provide value, or how are you going to serve those people? And then only then could you determine what's the most appropriate way for the people you serve to pay for the service you provide. You also saw that shift. of going from transactions to relationships. Like
Right.
one of my passions is going from a transactional business to a relationship focused business. And if you're focused on just quantitative metrics, sometimes you lose out on those opportunities to develop relationships and collaborations that really you can't measure with like, a number necessarily.
Right. Well, and what you really touched on, Cody, and I remember us talking about this, is there's pressures we feel of like we have to have other people's visions. And sometimes I see that with people that have too many mentors or too many coaches or too much stuff going on, too many hands in the jar, I guess, where it's like now they're feeling pressure of everybody's telling them what they should be going after and what they should be looking at, or read the $1 Million Advisor book and it's going to tell you what your vision really should be and how you should get there. And I just have a different view on it. And I think your coach that you look to hire should have a different view on it, which is it should be your vision. It should be what you want out of this. And again, going back to some core values of yours, what are your core values? How do you make sure that your vision aligns with your core values and that it gets you what you're really desiring to build? And so what we're really talking about here is just not feeling that pressure that your vision needs to be like others in the past. Be innovative, be you, make sure it fits within your area, and just have that ability to make it custom. And that's what your coach should be looking out for and trying to help you put together.
One of the biggest questions that comes to me is, okay, how can I find a coach? I'm not sure I can afford a coach yet because I just launched my business, and like I know that they would help me like accelerate, whatever my vision is, or like help me get to that maybe faster or with less pain along the way. But they say, oh, well, coaching, like from what I've seen, it's really expensive. If a business owner needs guidance but doesn't have the revenue to support hiring a coach one-on-one, like what are their options typically?
When you're taking up an experienced person's time to meet with you one-on-one and to coach you, there's going to be a price to that, right? Because they have options of other things they could be doing with their time and et cetera. And it makes sense. And there's value there. There's real value in the business world of a coach coaching you. If you're accomplishing more results and you're focused on the right things, it's going to have a huge return on investment. And so there's a cost there, but there's also a return on investment is what I always remind people. Again, just like any coach in sports or anything else, there should be growth and there should be a return on that investment of that time that you work together. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that I see people struggle with is early on in their career, they need a coach. They need help with things. They need leadership development when they're in that leadership role for the first time, but they're not in the financial situation where they can afford $20,000 a quarter or whatever the coach out there is that they're talking to, is charging. And so one of the things that I think is important to find is what are your resources of how to do that? And there's other platforms out there, of course, but we have built what we call Thriving Leaders University as this idea that, well, not everybody can afford what it takes to hire Brian or to hire one of my coaches on staff to just do a bunch of individual meetings with you and go deep like that, right? Because it takes cost on our side, it takes time, it's a valuable item, but not everybody's in the situation where that's fits within their P&L or their situation. So how could we create something sustainable? And I thought about it, I was like, I'm kind of a broken record sometimes when I am meeting with people where if I'm teaching Cody vision, well, I'm teaching the same thing to the next person and the next person and the next person. How could we make this more systematic and sustainable? And so we've recorded me teaching these different topics that I would teach somebody in a one-on-one into a private podcast that then is scalable for us to allow people to subscribe to and say, hey, I'm struggling with how to create a vision right now. I want more than what Brian did here today on this call. I want the full version of him teaching it. Here's how they can subscribe, get access to it, and do it. But then what you miss in that is accountability and still the one-on-one interaction when needed, because we all get stuck where it's like, hey, I need help, right? And so that's what we've added in Thriving Leaders University, is this ability for somebody to say, I need a one-on-one now, and they can schedule it and they can do that when needed. It's just not that regular cadence to help keep the cost down or give the person the ability to control their costs of what that looks like. And then the other component of it is then you got to have the resources and the other things that come with it, so that, as I put it, you never want to start with a blank sheet of paper when people have gone through what you're going through before. You're going to need to customize it to your situation, but don't start with a blank sheet of paper. And so we have templates that we give those Thriving Leader University clients access to where they're already off and running with a good template that, yeah, I want them to customize it and change it to their situation, but it gets you going so much more when you're looking at some kind of template than when you're just blank sheet of paper. What do I do in this area? And I've never done it before.
Just to clarify once more, I'm not being compensated or given like a discount on coaching from Brian, and I'm not paying.
Yep.
There's no transaction
Nope.
here. I invited Brian to share with us because, again, like I always want to share valuable things that I've learned from others. And again, you could have shared this conversation one-on-one with 100 people. But you're like, why not record it once and share it with hundreds more?
I don't think everybody needs to be a Thriving Leaders University client either. It just fits a certain type of group of people, and there's other platforms out there to check out. I think the biggest thing, what I would reiterate is, what you're looking for is, don't just hire a coach because they're a coach. Don't just hire a platform of development because they're a platform. What's the intentions behind it? Who does it really fit, and does it custom fit your area? Is this a generalist coach that works generally on things? Is this somebody that has experience in your industry as a deciding factor? And then you also have to look at what type of content is being produced by them and what are those topics. And that's what we try to be very clear on our website of, like, here's what we help with, here's what we don't help with, kind of thing. Right. And I think that's the biggest thing I would encourage people to pay attention to with coaches, and can be a trap. Sometimes coaches, and I saw an advertisement just this weekend from one that was like, we help anybody. It doesn't matter if you're an employee, this or that, like, list everything. We help everybody. And it's like, okay, well, there's probably some value there, but that value is going to be really limited because there's no depth to it. And we all know there's different situations, different industries, different challenges that we face, that you want to make sure you're attaching yourself to a mentor or a coach that can actually help you with what you need help with.
If you try to be everything to everybody, you're almost like nothing to nobody.
Right.
With that said, does it only make sense to work with a coach who's done what you want to do?
I don't think so. And I can personally speak to it, where I've hired 7 different coaches over my career. Okay. And if I think about that over this last decade, where I've hired 7 different coaches, there's one coach that I've had consistently the whole time. Okay. But then there was other coaches that I had that were more specialty coaches. Right. And then in the middle of that, some of the coaches I hired have never been a financial advisor, have never been in our industry. And I still got value out of that. But the timing of, like, how long should I be a client of theirs? What am I trying to get out of this relationship? What is it that they can provide me if it's in that route? It is just so important to have clear. And so guess what I'm talking about again? It's your vision. What's your vision for using a coach, right? What is it that you're trying to do, and think strategically as you're doing that, and then make sure you match yourself up with the people that in that moment can help with it. Okay. And so I've gone in different phases of that, but again, I've had that consistent one main leadership coach that I attach to, that knows me so well. It's kind of impossible for me to get rid of him even today, because if I run into issues, he's the one that I know will be honest with me. He's going to challenge me. He's going to call me out on my hypocrisy of something. Right. And that takes time to develop. I can't even walk in the door and do that with you or anybody else immediately. It takes time to develop the relationship to where somebody knows you so intimately that they know when you're not being honest with yourself, or they know when they need to push you or when to encourage you or do those different things. So it takes time. Whatever you go into, don't think it's a silver bullet. 1 month they're going to get me fixed, or et cetera. You got to build and work through their system and get to know them to really have a good relationship in whatever development you're pursuing.
Yeah. Creating analogies between a few things. Like one is like kind of the primary care physician. You have like your main doctor, and you have your specialist. I'm sure like you probably talk to specialists about, like, just in terms of merger and acquisition and like certain problems that you're having. In terms of financial planning, it's the same thing. Like, no financial planning client is going to come in and get like all their questions answered in full detail on the first meeting. Plan is a noun and a verb. It takes time. And like, Brian, when I started working with you, it like, I committed to like nine weeks straight, like 9 weeks. It wasn't 9 weeks of just like getting all my problems solved. It was like 9 weeks of actually like gaining understanding of what I'm trying to do before you could really give me the right tools. So what are the top books that you recommend to business owners when they say, hey, all those books on your bookshelf, like, which one should I read?
I'm just going to back up and say one thing when it comes to reading books that I think is so important. There's a difference between reading a book and studying a book. So if you read a book, you read the book, yeah, it has some nice points. I hear this all the time from people. It's like, wow, that book really impacted me. And if you talk to them 6 months later, the question is, so what are they doing differently based on that information from that book? And unfortunately, a lot of times, like, oh yeah, I read that book and it was such a great book. But if you really get down to the actions, what did it change in you? It didn't, right? And so what I look at with people is some people are wired and disciplined in a way where they can read a book and study it and implement and interpret and execute on it. And others benefit from reading a book with a mentor, with a coach, to where you have them as that study guide to help you through, what does this really mean? And man, I read this and it sounds great, but how the heck would I do that in my situation, right? And that's a gift that I feel like I've been given, of where I can connect the dots between the philosophical written in a book to customizing it to somebody's situation, to their vision, to their core values, to their dynamics, to implement change within their organization. And so I just wanted to start there, because I'm going to give you 3 books here that are kind of my top ones, but they're not a magic bullet in and of themselves. There's no book outside of the Bible that I've read that I agree more than 70% with, and that would include these books. If you're at 70%, you're in a good spot. But I disagree with them because I study them so tight. It's like, okay, these are the parts where I just don't agree with their philosophy and how that should be implemented. So a couple of the books that I would recommend, and they're kind of going to touch on different areas, is the book Switch, which is how to change things when change is hard. If you're looking at an industry like the financial advisor industry that's deeply rooted and grounded and has forces that are trying to keep it from moving,
the
to
ship moves slowly,
like that,
right?
Yeah. Then this is a book for you to read, because it's really walks through the dynamics of when things are hard to change, how do you do it? And what I love about this book is it goes through example after example where people actually impacted change, so that you actually do have strategies to consider. Again, how could I implement that in my situation and do something different? The book, The One Thing, which you can see behind my shoulder here, is a really important book to me, and the way that I've looked at a lot of different leadership components, because it's surprising how simple it is if you can focus in on the one thing that matters most, and really focusing on some qualifying questions like they teach in that book. It's amazing what you can accomplish and really restructure your day. And it gets back to this part of feeling overloaded. What do you do about it? The One Thing gives a lot of strategies that we can consider of how to implement in our life to change that overloaded feeling that we have. And then I think of the book, The Way of the Shepherd, which servant leadership, you and I have been talking about since the start of this meeting. And it's kind of like, The Way of the Shepherd walks through a number of different strategies in a story format. So it's not written as a do this, do this, do this. It's written as a story of a mentor coaching a college student about leadership and his first time managing people, and going through some farm examples and some biblical concepts and et cetera, of like, how does leadership work and what can you do about it? And so it's really a leadership skill book is what I would call it. And I guess I almost feel guilty of trying to stop there, because there's one more I can't leave off the list, which is The Dichotomy of Leadership. It's by Jocko, and if you've read his book Extreme Ownership or things
Right.
like that, I mean, he's very passionate, very good. But what I love about The Dichotomy of Leadership is, in our conversations about leadership, we're always struggling with this balance of, I have to be this and this at the same time, right? And so I'll give an example that he uses in the book. Like, I have to be close to the people I work with, but not so close that any of them feel like they're privileged among others in the group, right? And so that's that dichotomy of leadership, where it's like, how do I build really close relationships with my people, but not to where, I'll put it in my words, they feel like there's favoritism going on in the organization, right? And so there's this dichotomy of leadership that we have to work through. And I think it's just one of the best books I've read of helping us really think through and balance and know that there's an art, not a science, of how you are to act as a leader.
People have asked me, how do you come up with all your ideas?
Right.
And there's a few things I do. One certainly is reading. Learning from others is just really it, right? Learning from,
Right.
don't try to do this yourself, but others it kind of sounds funny, but take longer showers, right? Like in terms of like those shower thoughts are real. Like, when you're
Yep.
in that kind of drone, that moment, it's kind of meditative and mindful. Also take walks. So like sometimes like just taking a walk, actually, even without listening to something, can be
Yep.
really insightful. And when you take out the noise, sometimes it's much easier to like really understand your own vision rather than being influenced by everybody throwing stuff at you. So
Yep.
yeah, take showers, walks, and really just if you're having trouble coming up with ideas, just have more conversations with the people that you enjoy, talking with.
I started actually asking people what's one of the worst books you've read on leadership, and I'd like to read it, because what I've found is sometimes reading something I disagree with or that somebody else disagrees with can really be thought provoking on me to not just say, well, I disagree with that, but why? Like, why do I disagree on that book? So if I could throw you a curveball here to think about in reading books, is go read some bad books and teach yourself discernment to really be able to discern, this is bad and here's why, and therefore it makes me want to do the opposite, which is good. And that can actually help too. And so there's some bad books I've read recently where I've maybe gotten as much or more out of reading those books and studying those, because it helps determine in me, I don't want to be that. I don't want to act that way. This is how I want to act. And it can help you too. So it's just kind of a change up there of reading
Mm,
books. Cause I think I see a lot of people just pursue what's the best books, the best books, the best books. And it's like, if you read a bad book, you can get a lot out of that too. You just have to have
mm,
discernment of
right.
what shouldn't I be doing and what should I be doing instead.
There's a book called How to Live. It's 27 conflicting answers by
Okay.
Derek Sivers. What's amazing is like, so chapter 1 will be telling you to do everything this way, and then chapter 2 will actually say everything the opposite. So
Yep.
you actually start to understand where you are on that spectrum of binary thinking, and by
Yep.
by knowing, by disagreeing, you actually clarify your idea and your vision even more so,
Yeah.
because
What
it goes the
what it's
opposite
bringing
direction.
out, yeah, what it's bringing out is if every book you read, you agree with everything that's in that book, man, you're in a danger zone, right? Because again, I say I've never read a book outside of the Bible that I agree more than 70% with. I
Mm.
disagree even with these books I've mentioned with about a third of what's in those books. The question is, what are those third, right? And why do I disagree with those third? And what would I do differently? That's what I would challenge everybody to be aware of, and start to build that discernment in. And if you do agree with everything you read, then that's a good point. You need to find a coach or a mentor to help you start to discern through that information of what's good and what's bad.
When you're working with a coach, like this should be a meeting that you come out energized. It should be energy giving, not energy draining. So that might be another kind of thing to you. If you feel like you're coming out of these conversations like actually like lacking ideas and lacking energy, like maybe that might not be the right one. Kind of talking about that dichotomy, the conflicting answers. I really appreciate you being here and sharing with the Measure Twice Planners community. I'm going to share all the resources that you mentioned in the notes. I
Yep.
appreciate you being here and love the work that you do to really help others become better versions of themselves.
Appreciate you too, Cody, and appreciate all that you're building. And just it's a great partnership, and great talking with you.